a tremendous pleasure to be here and to feel the energy of this terrific moment of feminism's burst onto the Spanish scene. I have to say, as an American, I can only envy you the huge turnout on March 8th of last year, of this year, this large crowd here. Maybe if somehow you could inspire Americans to imitate you, we'd all be in great shape. I have to thank Carlos Prieta for this invitation here, and the organization and the rest of the museum staff for hosting this event. And I have to thank Maria Miguenia and Montserrat for these extraordinary opening remarks. I could not have asked for a more perfect setup, or a more perfect introduction to what I'm going to say. This critique of liberal feminism, or as you correctly called it, business or corporate feminism, is very much in tune with my own thinking. And I'm going to steal this line: feminism must be anti-capitalist because capitalism is anti-feminist. You could not put this in a more perfect, succinct way. So, with that sort of start, I think I can launch right into my own remarks. And I start with, I think, a very simple observation, which I trust you will agree with. Namely, we are living in a time of very acute societal crisis and extreme or aggravated political confusion. In times like these, those who want to intervene practically need a clear-eyed grasp of the lay of the land. This is true for feminists and environmentalists, for anti-racist and migrant rights activists. It's true for labor unions and for LGBTQ movements, for populist and anti-capitalist parties, indeed for just about anyone who is committed to opposing finance capital on the one hand and racist authoritarianism on the other hand. All of these actors need a perspective that can grasp the extent and nature of the present crisis, that can identify its true causes, and that can clarify what must be done to promote an emancipatory resolution of it. Absent such a guiding perspective, they risk seeing their efforts hijacked by powerful social forces with opposing aims. Only by grasping the distinctive dynamics of the present situation can they or we chart a path that leads beyond it, through political realignment to societal transformation. What is needed, in a word, is a critical theory of contemporary society. Unfortunately, however, our received paradigms of critical theory are not really up to this task. Many of them tend to be one-dimensional, focused either exclusively on cultural concerns or alternatively on the economy. But the theory we need today must be multi-dimensional, not one-dimensional in either of those two senses. Our theory must encompass not only the economic face of the crisis, but also its other phases: social, ecological, and political. It must encompass not only the class dimension of domination, real and important as that is, but also other aspects pertaining to gender and sexuality, to race, ethnicity, and nationality, to political authoritarianism and ecological degradation. In the present conjuncture, all these phases of crisis and forms of domination entwine with and exacerbate one another. Only a critical theory that accommodates all of them can possibly capture the present complexities and guide us through them. Nevertheless, it would be a huge mistake to adopt an approach that fetishizes multiplicity and contingency, That sort of thinking is no more able to clarify our situation than is monistic economism or reductive culturalism. Far from forming a dispersed plurality, the various difficulties we face today are interconnected, and they share a common source. All are grounded in the deep structure of contemporary capitalism, which is globalizing, neoliberal, and financialized. A critical theory for our time must be a theory of financialized capitalism, but one that avoids any hint of reductive economism. Instead of conceiving capitalism narrowly as an economic system, such a theory must conceptualize it broadly as an institutionalized social order, something that's much bigger than a mere economy. Only this sort of expanded view of capitalism can do justice to a crisis that is at once multidimensional and grounded in a single identifiable social formation. Now, my own recent work has aimed to develop this sort of critical theory. In the present lecture, I'm going to try to sketch some elements of it with the aim of clarifying some conceptual links between capitalist crisis, gender domination, and class struggle. My argument unfolds in 3 steps. First, I'm going to present an expanded view of capitalism that can accommodate multiple forms of domination and multiple crisis tendencies. Second, I'm going to develop this conception in more detail with respect to gender and explain the implications for how we should think about class and class struggle. Finally, I'll try to describe very, very briefly the current state of hegemonic struggle, and I'll suggest a strategy for intervening in it. So, first, capitalist society and capitalist crisis, an expanded view. I'm going to begin with the concept of crisis. To say that we live in a time of crisis is not simply to say that things are bad, a judgment that is amply attested by multiple wars, global warming, declining living standards, rising inequality, mounting stress on families and communities, intensified racial and gender oppression, mass production of refugees, and massive scapegoating of migrants, proliferation of authoritarian movements, and brutal regimes. The sheer fact of these calamities and of the suffering bound up with them is horrific beyond any doubt. But what justifies the use of the term crisis is something more. The numerous harms we experience today are neither mutually unrelated nor the products of chance. They stem, rather, from the societal system that underlies them, a system that generates them not accidentally, but as a matter of course, by virtue of its constitutive dynamics. That social system, I claim, is capitalism, or rather, the present form of capitalism, as I said, globalizing, neoliberal, financialized. For systemic reasons, grounded in its own deep-seated contradictions, this form of capitalist society is coming apart. It's unraveling before our eyes. Not in the sense that capitalists are having trouble making profits, but that it is destroying its own conditions of possibility. Not confined to any single region or any one sector of social life, its dysfunctions proliferate throughout the entire social landscape. The result is a general crisis, not simply an economic crisis or an ecological crisis or social or political crisis, but a general crisis in the sense that historians write about, for example, the general crisis of the 17th century or the crisis of the 1930s. These are other examples of general crisis. It's a general crisis of this social system as such. Now, to see why, we've got to look more closely at the definition of what we mean by capitalism. Usually, capitalism is understood narrowly as an economic system. That is certainly the standard understanding of so-called bourgeois economists of the classical and neoclassical schools. But they are not alone in this. Even many Marxists have subscribed to a version of this narrow definition. Granted, they penetrate beneath the bourgeois perspective of commodity exchange to the more fundamental level of commodity production. And there they discover the secret of accumulation in capital's exploitation of waged laborers, who are recompensed only for the socially necessary costs of their own reproduction, while the surplus value their labor generates goes instead to the capitalist. Now, as they see it, this exploitative process is the crux of the capitalist system, the source of capital's otherwise mysterious capacity to self-expand. That capacity resides in the relation between two classes. On the one hand, the capitalists who own the society's means of production and appropriate its surplus. On the other hand, the free but propertyless producers who must sell their labor power piecemeal in order to live. Capitalism, on this view, is a system of class domination, to be sure. And class domination is centered in the realm of economic production, where capital is valorized through the monetized exchange of labor power for wages. This is a brief sketch of the traditional Marxist view of what capitalism is. And I have to say, it's a huge improvement over that of the dismal scientists who populate the economics departments of nearly all of our universities. Its account of exploitation and class domination is spot on in identifying some of the most fateful and important forces that drive developments in capitalist societies. And it offers a genuinely critical perspective on these forces. Unlike the ideologues who see nothing amiss in these arrangements, those who subscribe to the Marxian view of capitalism as an economic system centered on working class exploitation see that system not only as unjust, but also as inherently crisis-prone. In their view, capitalism's orientation to limitless accumulation through the exploitation of wage labor tends over time to raise the organic composition of capital, exerting downward pressures on the rate of profit, intensifying competition, and encouraging financial speculation, developments that lead periodically to economic crises. Details aside, we can say that for this sort of traditional Marxism, capitalist crisis has its roots in an economic system that harbors mutually contradictory imperatives within itself. Now, I take it as given that these accounts of capitalism and capitalist crisis are genuinely insightful, that they have some actual critical purchase on social reality. But I nevertheless consider them too narrow, not broad enough to clarify the actual crisis of capitalism we are living through now. The problem is that this traditional Marxian view focuses overwhelmingly on aspects of social processes and social relations that are monetized, that are denominated in the metric of exchange value. Whether we are talking about production, circulation, or distribution, the relations in question are situated within the precincts that capitalist society itself defines as economic. And the processes involve activities that capital itself considers as having value. So this is a somewhat restricted view of capitalism that brings with it a restricted view of capitalist crisis, one focused on contradictions internal to the economy. What generates crisis on this view are the internal dynamics of the economic system, which harbor a built-in tendency to self-destabilization. The principal expression of capitalist crisis is, therefore, itself economic. Market crashes, bankruptcy chains, the bursting of speculative bubbles, currency collapses, depressions, widespread cessation of production, and mass unemployment, all of which are located within this economic sphere. Now, I call this conception narrow because it leaves out a great deal. It leaves out the entire swath of social relations and processes which capitalist society defines as non-economic, but which nevertheless supply the necessary supports for a capitalist economy. Behind capitalism's official institutions, wage labor, production, exchange, finance, stand their enabling conditions: families, communities, nature, territorial states, political organizations, civil society relations, and not least of all, massive amounts and multiple forms of unwaged and expropriated labor, including much of the work of social reproduction, still performed largely by women and often still uncompensated. Although these things are overlooked or shunted aside by the narrow understanding of capitalism as an economic system, they too are constitutive elements of capitalist society. Let's consider first the unwaged activities of social reproduction, which assure the supply of wage labor for economic production, as well as the social bonds, solidarities, and forms of trust that sustain capitalist society more generally. The capitalist economy literally could not function without these activities, even though it has historically accorded them little or no monetized value and often does not pay for them still. On the contrary, capitalism's economy free rides on the unwaged work of social reproduction, which it has historically assigned to and associated with women. Now, the same is true for the labor and land of racialized others, which capital simply seizes without any pretext of exchanging equivalents. From New World slavery to colonialism, from apartheid to the post-colonial neo-imperialism of the present day, the capitalist system has always relied on such extra-contractual confiscation to supply cheap inputs that enable it to profitably exploit free labor. Racialized expropriation, too, serves as a hidden enabling condition for capital accumulation. Exploitation could not exist without expropriation. A similar point holds for state power, which is a third necessary non-economic condition for a capitalist economy. The non-economic apparatuses of states and now of transnational public powers, I'm thinking of law, police, regulatory agencies, steering capacities. All of these supply the needed order, predictability, and infrastructure that are necessary for sustained accumulation. These, too, are indispensable to capitalist commerce, even though such commerce free rides on them as well. Equally necessary, finally, is a fourth non-economic background conditions, and that is a relatively sustainable organization of our metabolic interaction with the rest of nature, one that ensures essential supplies of energy and raw materials for commodity production, not to mention a habitable planet that can support life. Absent this ecological condition, capital accumulation would grind to a halt. Well, these are all additional hidden abodes, as Marx might say, that an expanded view of capitalism must include. Such an expanded view must include these background conditions, as well as, of course, the foreground economic system they undergird. My key move in presenting this argument is actually similar to the one made by Marx in Volume 1 of Capital. You'll remember that there he viewed exploitative production as a hidden abode beneath market exchange, a hidden abode that harbored the dirty secret of exploitation, namely that workers are paid only the average socially necessary costs of their reproduction. In the same spirit, this expanded view of capitalism I'm outlining treats social reproduction, expropriated, racialized labor and property, public power, and historical nature as additional hidden abodes, more hidden still even than that of production, that lie beneath the sphere of production and that contain even dirtier secrets, namely that capital free rides on them, expropriating productive inputs and conditions of production for whose reproduction it does not pay, or certainly does not fully pay. And that distinguishes them and makes them, let's say, even dirtier than exploitation of labor, where by definition, according to Marx, capital does pay the costs of reproduction. In fact, it doesn't always, but that's another matter. In other words, this sort of appropriation or expropriation lies beneath exploitation and renders it possible. So, as you can see, on this expanded view, capitalism is no mere economic system, but something much larger, an institutionalized social order, something on a par in terms of scale, for example, with feudalism. It's a way of organizing a whole form of life, not just an economy. It is built on a distinctive set of institutional divisions. First, the separation of economic production from social reproduction, which corresponds to the division between wage work in the sphere of commodity production and unpaid work in the sphere of social reproduction, which we know is a gendered division historically. Second, the separation of unfree expropriated labor from what Marx called doubly free exploited labor, which corresponds to the global color line. And third, the separation of the economic from the political, which corresponds both to the division between public power that's supposed to be accountable to all of us from private power of corporations, on which we don't get to have much of a say, and to that between core and periphery. Finally, we have the institutionalized separation, a sharp separation between human society on the one hand and non-human nature on the other, which corresponds to a host of ideological and practical divisions between living spirit and dead matter, historical agency, and inert objectivity. Now, I'm claiming that these institutional separations are specific to and constitutive of capitalist society. So, too, are the social relations of domination to which they correspond. Thanks to the separation of production from reproduction, gender asymmetry is structurally entrenched in capitalist societies, part and parcel of their DNA. Likewise, the system's separation of exploited from expropriated labor grounds racial ethnic oppression in capitalism's very deep constitutive structure. Then, too, its characteristic separation of the economic from the political entrenches political domination as non-accidental. And finally, capitalism's installation of what John Bellamy Foster has called a metabolic rift between human society and non-human nature provides a systemic basis for ongoing ecological predation. In every case, the domination in question is structural, every bit as structural as the exploitation of wage labor, diagnosed by the narrower view of capitalism. So this expanded view of capitalism, I'm suggesting, affords a powerful rejoinder for those who trivialize these forms of injustice by casting them as secondary or epiphenomenal. Equally important, capitalism's institutionalized divisions are seedbeds of crisis. These divisions establish a peculiar relation, which I call separation, cum dependence, cum disavowal, a peculiar relation between the capitalist economy and its necessary background conditions of possibility. And the result is a built-in source of potential instability. On the one hand, capital accumulation is not self-sustaining, but relies on gendered social reproduction, racialized expropriation, non-democratic organization of public and private power, and devalued nature. On the other hand, the capital's drive to unlimited accumulation threatens to destabilize the very processes and capacities that capital and the rest of us need. The effect over time can be to jeopardize the necessary background conditions of the capitalist economy. So, over and above its economic contradictions, the ones that Marxists have theorized, capitalism harbors at least 4 additional non-economic crisis tendencies. There is first a social reproductive contradiction built into capitalism, a drive to commandeer for capital's benefit as much free reproductive labor as possible without any concern for its replenishment, for reproducing it. As a result, this system periodically gives rise to so-called crises of care or of social reproduction, which exhaust women, ravage families, and stretch social energies to the breaking point. I think we know about this very concretely today. There is also built into capitalism a second political contradiction, a built-in tendency to limit the purview of politics, devolving fundamental matters of life and death to the rule of the markets, which really means to the rule of the corporations, and turning state institutions that are supposed to serve the public into capital's servants. For systemic reasons, therefore, capitalism is disposed to frustrate democratic aspirations, to hollow out rights, to defang public powers, and to generate brutal repression, endless wars, and crises of governance. Sound familiar in the current landscape? Then, finally, there is an ecological contradiction, an inherent tendency to reduce nature to a tap, dispensing energy and raw materials on the one hand, and to a sink for absorbing waste on the other. Both capacities that capital appropriates freely, but does not replenish, does not even acknowledge. As a result, capitalist societies are structurally inclined to destabilize the habitats that sustain communities and to destroy the ecosystems that sustain life. So, on the expanded view of capitalism, viewed now as an institutionalized social order, these non-economic dysfunctions are not accidental but systemic. They arise from contradictions in the deep structure of this social formation, just like the economic dysfunctions theorized in the narrower view. The expanded view of capitalism brings with it, then, an expanded view of capitalist crisis. However, I want to qualify that this view does not, in itself or in any sense, refute the Marxian account of capitalism's economic contradictions. That view captures one important feature of a social order subject to repeated economic depressions and financial crashes. Absent some account of the system's tendency to overaccumulate capital and underproduce demand, we'd be hard-pressed to understand the near meltdown of the global financial system in 2007-2008. What the expanded view does do, however, is offer us the chance to integrate Marxist theory with the best insights of other paradigms, of feminist theory, of anti-imperialist and critical race theory, of political ecology, and of democratic theory. It allows us to bring all these resources to bear in a critique of the forms of structural crisis and of social struggle we experience now in the financialized capitalism of the present era. Our present crisis is multifaceted, encompassing not only economic and financial strands, but as I said before, ecological, political, and social reproductive strands as well. And it cannot be understood adequately by means of an economistic critical theory. The expanded view also alters our understanding of the characteristic forms of social struggle in a capitalist society. It clarifies something that must be ultimately mysterious for the narrower view, namely that social conflict in capitalist societies has repeatedly assumed the guise not only of class struggles in the classical sense, of struggles over the organization of production, but also of struggles over nature, over social reproduction, over imperialism, over democracy, over race, and over debt. The expanded view invites us to conceive these as what I would like to call boundary struggles, as struggles that concern the existence, location, and character of the boundaries separating economy from polity, commodity production from social reproduction, exploitation from expropriation, human society from non-human nature, right? I sketched a picture of a social order that delimits and demarcates these things, setting up the boundaries as sites and foci of social struggles. These boundaries are not given once and for all in capitalist society. On the contrary, social actors have repeatedly mobilized around them, seeking to contest or defend them, to relocate or even to abolish them, especially in periods of crisis. And sometimes social struggles have actually succeeded in redrawing the boundaries. Struggles over whether, where, and how to divide states from markets, factories from families, exploited from expropriated labor, and society from nature are as fundamental to capitalist society, as deeply grounded in its institutional structure, as is contestation over the rate of exploitation or the distribution of surplus value. Examples of boundary struggles include struggles over clean water, housing, fishing rights, police violence, childcare, and many, many other things. Pace economistic Marxism, which I might add may not in fact be the Marxism of Karl Marx, these are neither secondary contradictions nor epiphenomenal expressions of economic realities. This idea of boundary struggles helps to explain the historical development of capitalist society over time. That development is best understood, I think, as a path-dependent sequence of regimes of accumulation, such as mercantile capitalism, laissez-faire colonial capitalism, state-managed capitalism, and our own neoliberal financialized capitalism. The historical sequence of regimes is punctuated by general crises which inspire large-scale waves of social action that prompt the transition from one regime to another. These are general crises, and they are relatively rare historical moments when economic, social, political, and ecological strands converge, convincing critical masses of people that they cannot go on in the same old way, but need to transform the social organization in which they live in a far-reaching way. Of course, in normal times, the system's crisis tendencies remain more or less latent. They stay under wraps. Or we could say they afflict only those populations deemed disposable and too powerless to cause any trouble. Then the crisis is over there. It doesn't count as a real crisis. But we do not live in normal times. Today, all of capitalism's contradictions have reached the boiling point. 4 decades of neoliberalism have driven down wages, weakened labor rights, ravaged the environment, usurped the energies available to sustain families and communities, all while spreading the tentacles of finance throughout the whole social fabric. Virtually no one, with the partial exception of the 1%, and even that is a partial exception, escapes the impacts of political dislocation, economic precarity, and social reproductive depletion. And of course, climate change threatens to destroy all life on the planet as such. The recognition is growing too that these catastrophic developments are so deeply intertwined that none of them can be resolved apart from the others. Emancipatory movements must address this crisis in its totality. One such movement, feminism, takes a special interest in the social reproductive dimension of the present crisis. And the reasons should already be clear. That crisis is rooted in capitalism's constitutive separation of production from reproduction, which is a major driver of that strand of crisis, and also a major source of women's oppression. Now, it's true, of course, that capitalism did not invent the subordination of women. The latter existed in various forms in all previous class societies. But capitalism established new, distinctively modern forms of sexism, underpinned by new institutional structures. Its key move, I've already suggested, was to hive off the making of profit from the making of people, to assign the second job to women and to subordinate it to the first. With this stroke, capitalism simultaneously reinvented women's oppression in a new guise and turned the whole world upside down. This arrangement is deeply, deeply perverse. Just consider how vital and complex the work of people-making actually is. Not only does this activity create and sustain life in the biological sense, it also creates and sustains our capacity to work. Again, what Marx called our labor power. And that means fashioning people with the right attitudes, dispositions, and values, with the needed abilities, competences, and skills. All told, people-making work supplies some of the fundamental preconditions, material, social, and cultural, for human society in general, and for capitalist production in particular. Without it, neither life nor labor power could be embodied in human beings. So people-making is much broader than domestic labor. Aimed at creating and maintaining social bonds, it encompasses intergenerational ties, hence the birthing and raising of children, caring for the elderly, but also horizontal ties among friends, family, neighborhood residents, communities. This sort of activity is essential to every society, capitalist or otherwise. It is simultaneously affective and material labor, and it produces both the human subjects who constitute labor and the social glue that underpins the possibility of any form of social cooperation. Without it, there would be no social organization, no economy, no state, no culture. Feminist theorists, and myself among them, call this vast body of vital activity social reproduction. For those who seek to overcome gender oppression, there can be no more central issue than social reproduction. Historically, this activity has always been gendered, with the lion's share of responsibility for it assigned to women. But social reproduction assumes a distinctive, let's say, hyper-gendered guise in capitalist societies, which for the first time sharply separated from the sphere which they create at the same moment of economic production. Systematically splitting these two activities apart, treating them as two categorically different forms of social activity, it locates work on the one hand and care in the other in two distinct institutions and coordinates them in two different ways. Production, we know, moved into factories, mines, and offices, where it was considered economic and remunerated with cash wages, while reproduction was relegated to a private domestic sphere where it was feminized and sentimentalized, performed supposedly for the sake of love as opposed to money. Or at least that's the story we are told. Because when you look more deeply, capitalist societies have never actually located social reproduction exclusively in private households. They've always placed some of it in neighborhoods, grassroots communities, public institutions like schools and so on, and in civil society. And they have always commodified some of it. Just think of servants to the upper classes of Victorian England, wet nurses in France. They've always commodified some of it, but nowhere near as much as today.